Hi class, welcome to the video for Unit 2. In this video we are going to look at the theory of intersectionality, which is the key theory that we use in contemporary feminist theory. In the video I'm going to define intersectionality for you, and we are going to look at the use of intersectionality in some of the key texts that you are to read within Unit 2, and intersectionality is going to be a theory that's going to serve us well throughout the semester. You're going to be using it from this point forward. You are going to be asked to demonstrate understanding of intersectionality throughout the remaining assignments that you have. So you want to make sure that you have a good working understanding of what intersectionality is, and especially the two ways in which we generally use the theory of intersectionality, which I'll get into in a little bit, but to foreshadow, the two levels of intersectional consideration are the levels of identity, so the personal. My identity is intersectional. I am a woman, but I'm also white. These components of my identity intersect, and they are meaningful in a unified and synthesized way in the various experiences that I have in my life. You can't separate my whiteness from my womanhood within a social world that is defined by sexism and anti-Black racism. So my whiteness might provide me protection, but my gender might mean that certain assumptions are made about me. But in all experiences, these things work together, and they are experienced as unified for me. And then the second level is the level of the political. So the political is invoked in even talking about the personal, but the political is an analysis of the institutional or structural systems that function according to these hierarchies of identity. So when we think about the institution of work, the way that Black women experience sexual harassment is going to be different than the way in which white women experience sexual harassment. As women, white women and Black women are more likely to experience sexual harassment in work than white men and Black men, but the forms of sexual harassment that Black women will experience are going to oftentimes be tinged with or have as a constituent element elements of anti-Black racism in addition to sexism. So a sexist hierarchy is often reinforced in sexual harassment or through the practice of sexual harassment. But when we're thinking about women of color, the kinds of harassing behaviors that they encounter are not just sexist, but they're oftentimes also racist. All right, so first we're going to start with a little bit of history. Then we'll talk about the two levels of intersectional analysis that are necessary, and then we'll close by looking at some examples from the course materials this week. All right, so intersectionality, again, is the key theory in contemporary feminist theory. The term itself was coined by Black American legal theorist and law professor Kimberly Crenshaw in an essay from 1991. But the heart of the theory of intersectionality has been prominent within feminists of color theories throughout the history of US-based feminism as well as European feminism, and it certainly plays a role in Africana feminism, Caribbean-based feminisms, etc. So even if that term hasn't historically existed, the theoretical meat of intersectionality has existed throughout the history of feminist work, especially feminist work that has been performed or created through the work of feminists of color. So what Kimberly Crenshaw is specifically thinking about as a legal theorist is sexual harassment. So as she's thinking about the ways in which women experience sexual harassment at work. She's also thinking about the differences that exist in terms of the kinds of sexual harassment that exist, and how sexual harassment is oftentimes not just used in order to reinforce sexist or gendered hierarchies, but is also used to reinforce racist hierarchies, or to reinforce white normativity or white supremacy, or to devalue Black and brown peoples, and specifically Black and brown women, Black and brown non-binary people, Black and brown trans people, in institutional settings, so in school, in work, in the street, etc. A way to think about the intersectional considerations that Crenshaw begins with is to think about the way in which, when women of color experience sexual harassment, the sexual harassment they experience is not merely sexist, it is also oftentimes racist. And this is because you can't separate the racialized identities of Black women from their gendered identities. They come together, they're unified, they're synthesized in the very material being or bodies or personhood of Black women. So in this course, I want you to understand the history of the development of this term, the roots of this term, and the way in which it pushes back on a history of the supposed homogeneity of feminine identity. So what intersectionality does is it problematizes throughout the history of feminism the idea that there is a universal construct of womanhood. So in contemporary feminist frameworks, the notion that there is a universal construct of womanhood is problematized through the theory of intersectionality. And what that leaves us with is both a multiplicity of feminist perspectives or standpoints from which we operate, from which we deconstruct meaning, from which we offer critique of patriarchal institutions and attitudes. It also creates a context in which we can begin to think more complexly, or in more complex terms, about the meaning of identity, privilege, and oppression together. So some examples, when we look at Lord's recounting of her childhood and her development in Zami, we see over and over again that Lord's gender, Lord's racialized identity, her Blackness, and her queer identity intersect. And so when she experiences oppression, there isn't just a circumstance where she experiences sexist discrimination or a barrier at school that is the result of only racism, but rather these components of her identity come together and intersect in her being, and the multiple systems of meaning work against her. So Lord experiences barriers not just because she's a girl and a woman, as we move through Zami, as she develops in her womanhood, but because she's a queer Black girl or a queer Black woman. So we're looking at the ways in which, again, both in her personhood and then on the level of systems, attitudes, and institutional barriers operate according to norms simultaneously that are based, in effect, in male supremacy and white supremacy and heterosexism when we're thinking about Zami. So again, using this example, we can further explore what intersectionality means. So again, on the level of the individual, intersectionality as a theory shows us that oppression and privilege are experienced in varying configurations and in varying degrees of intensity, and depend upon the multiple identities that we occupy at once. So one of the PowerPoint slides will give you some examples of this. So one example would be that the Black, lesbian, transgender woman's experience is going to be different than the white Jewish single mother's experience with sexism. Both will experience sexism both are women, but the Black, lesbian, trans woman will experience sexism that is also informed by anti-Black racism, that is informed by transphobia, that is informed by homophobia. And the white, Jewish, working class, single mother is going to experience sexism that can't be disentangled neatly or perfectly from anti-Semitism, or from the fact that she performs heterosexual sexual identity in a way that is imperfect according to standards of monogamy and marriage that oftentimes occupy the dominant mythical norm that exists in the United States. So even though she's white, she experiences oppression on the basis of the intersection of her Jewish identity, her sexual orientation, her status as a mother, a single mother, and the fact that she does not belong to the middle class. So all of these are going to function to inform or to frame or to intersect with the kind of sexism and the kinds of sexisms that she will experience. So they come together. And they're synthesized in the experience of the person who experiences them, but they're also synthesized through the cultural systems and patterns of oppression because these cultural patterns are interrelated and because they oftentimes operate according to the same standards. That idea of like hierarchical ordering of identity you should recognize is present in all of these forms of oppression and privilege. When we're thinking about the hierarchy of masculinity over femininity. Masculinity is culturally valued more than femininity. In Unit 1, we looked at what that means for women and why the definition of feminism being about equality doesn't quite work. Because you could require that everyone attempt to embody masculine norms and judge them on the basis of whether or not they succeed or fail to embody masculine norms, regardless of their gender identities. But this does not end sexism. It just means that women, that trans people, that non-binary persons, that genderqueer folk can succeed insofar as they embrace masculinity. So that's not the ending of sexism. And so another hierarchical system that operates and that Lord draws our attention to, that Alice Walker draws our attention to, that we are going to further explore when we look at Simpson's work later this semester, when we look at Adrian Piper's work later this semester, are the various ways in which the system of white over black and brown functions in a similar way. It's not the same, so you can't take sexism and racism and say that the systems are exactly the same and that we can take the analysis of sexist oppression and apply it in this like one-to-one relationship to analyses of anti-black racism. But that hierarchy is similar, and oftentimes the assimilation that's required of the oppressed is similar. So in the same way that in contemporary societies, people of color can be valued insofar as they attempt to embody or value whiteness, or they take on white norms, then this is not really the ending of anti-black racism. It just means that if one assimilates as a person of color to norms of whiteness, if one becomes culturally whiter, as Franz Fanon would say, if one abandons one's blackness or brownness, then one can be valued to some degree. Now, this does not work perfectly, as we will see throughout the semester, but it's also certainly not indicative of the ending of racism. So requiring that people of color value whiteness above blackness in order to be valued is not the ending of racism. And it's a way in which equality, in the same way that we covered in Unit 1, can be used in a way to attempt to cover up discrepancies in value that emerge or appear within social worlds. So The second thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to think about the background for intersectionality. So some important background groundings to consider as we're learning or understanding intersectionality is first the fact that identity is constructed in society. My identity doesn't live in me. So my identity as a woman is not constructed fully or purely by me. Rather, it's constructed in society. And the meaning of womanhood is constructed outside of me. And I comport myself in relation to those constructed meanings. And I'm read through the way in which that meaning is constructed on the level of the social. So I feel my identity to exist inside of me. I feel my sexual orientation to emanate from me. I feel my gender identity to emanate from me. And so on some level it does. On the level of the affect or the affective level, on the level of feeling, it certainly comes from me. But in terms of concrete meaning and what it means in terms of understanding institutional power or structural power or my ability to affect change in the world, what it means, what my identity means, doesn't come from me. So the idea that in order to overcome sexism, I just have to be stronger, or to overcome racism, a person of color just has to be perfect, that doesn't really work, because the meaning of masculinity, the meaning of femininity, the meaning of whiteness, the meaning of blackness, they don't come from the individual. They're cultural values through which people are read and through which meaning is mapped onto people that appear according to the performative standards of gender, racialized identity, sexual orientation, class, ability, disability, etc. Second, it isn't just that our meanings the meanings of our identity are constructed outside of us in the realm of the social or the political, but rather they acquire value within this realm or through this constructivist aspect as well. So the meaning of our identities are constructed in and through social space. So it doesn't matter if I value femininity, it doesn't matter if I value those traditional norms that are associated with femininity. If they are not valued within society, then my personal affective relationship to traditional feminine values is going to be meaningless. So for example, it's not just that we don't value. So what sexism is not just the devaluing of feminine identified people or women. It's a devaluing culturally of those gendered associations. So those gendered associations of caregiving, of sensitivity, of vulnerability, of softness. Those are traits that are culturally devalued, of dependence, of cooperation. So if you think about the qualities of leadership, any gendered person can be a leader, but what tends to constitute descriptions of leaders in the abstract sense are oftentimes fully masculine values. So that creates a context for ideological or symbolic barriers for women whose leadership qualities don't match the abstract definition of what a leader is: independent, competitive, in charge, etc. So instead of looking at the way in which interdependence, looking at the way in which sensitivity, caring can also be forms of leadership qualities, we devalue not just women, but those feminine traits as well, and continue a system of sexism. All right, and the second sort of major theme of this video is a question that's raised in the Lanza article, and that question is related to our considerations of intersectionality and some of the musings that I just covered about the context of leadership and how we read leadership. And the second major point is a question of whom can represent. So it's a continuation of a theme covered in the introduction of your interfaces text. So the idea of how artists are read is continued in the Lanza essay, but it's probed a bit more deeper, because not only do others read us, but we react to the way in which we are read by others. So think back to that example of Amin's My Bed. The artwork that she produces is read according to gendered and sexist and classist standards. But what Lanza does is consider the ways in which this can function as a barrier, this placing upon women, the requirement that they adhere to feminine norms can create a context for the prohibiting of self-representation itself. So others can press upon our ability to freely project or engage in the creative act of self-representation through the use of gendered expectations. So this question is a question of access. So we often think that women are less likely to be read, women are less likely to direct films, women are less likely to be paid well for the self-representations they produce because they don't engage in the work of self-representation. So we oftentimes blame women for the fact that women are less likely to self-represent. But in this course, we want to think on a deeper level. We want to critically examine the kinds of social norms and institutional barriers that function to deny access to women being able to freely self-represent. So this argument that women just don't engage in the work of self-representation is flawed in many ways. As we encountered in Unit 1, women do engage in the work of self-representation, as do people of color, as do queer peoples, as do low-income, low-wealth persons, but their contributions are oftentimes read or understood as particular and thus less valuable. So the construct of universality being associated with whiteness, with heterosexuality, with masculinity, with able-bodiedness, with upper middle class identity functions to create a context in which the productions of women, people of color, same-sex oriented people, trans people, queer people generally, low-income, low-wealth people are not read as representations that are meaningful beyond the particular group to which one belongs. So we want to think about the way in which not only can marginalized populations provide access to understanding of what it means to be human, because they are human, but also when we engage in furthering this assumption that whiteness is universal, or that masculinity is universal, or that heterosexuality is universal, we fail to account for the particularity that exists when white men produce self-representations. So white men do produce self-representations from a particular cultural location, and that cultural location is oftentimes peppered or papered over. So on the one hand, we need to rethink how we understand the contributions of marginalized populations, and that we understand that they contribute to an understanding of the human condition in this more universal sense. But also we have to add back in to the contributions of white people, heterosexual people, masculine identified people, the fact that they are culturally located. They come from a specific or local position, and that is not a universal position. Second, we want to think about the way in which gender norms play a role in creating a context for a gendered form of permission to self-represent itself. So Lanza spends a lot of time looking at the kinds of guilt that women experience as they seek to engage in self-representation, especially when self-representation invokes depiction of the family, and the way in which gendered norms of femininity can often function to create a context for prohibition of telling the secrets of the family as one engages in self-representation. Because if we think about what it is to self-represent, when I'm representing myself, if I write a personal essay, or if I create a visual work of art that represents me, or if I engage in a work of performance art or street art, then what I'm invoking as I'm invoking a representation of myself is not just merely myself. Myself is formed. The self that I occupy, or the self that I understand myself to be, is very much informed by a history that invokes other people, that includes other people. And as women have traditionally been associated with the family, as women seek to self-represent, they're oftentimes framed by the family itself as telling the secrets of the family. So it can create discord within the family when women seek to engage in the independent act of self-representation. It looks like she's pulling away. She's separating herself from that role or that position that she is supposed to culturally occupy. And then the second part is that guilt is oftentimes imposed upon her for telling the private side of the family that extends beyond her mere self. And so this guilt is often felt, or is more pronounced in the lives of women more than it is in the lives of men because of those gendered expectations. It doesn't mean that men will never feel guilt if they tell a secret of the family. That is not what this means at all. But the gendered expectations of protection, of privacy, of the family realm, of the family unit oftentimes fall onto women. And thus those experiences of guilt are much more likely to be placed upon her by the family or even by critics who read her work, whether it's a visual work or a written narrative or performative work, who read her narratives as engaging in like salacious gossip or as unfairly criticizing the family unit, etc. So she's oftentimes read as though she's supposed to protect the family, and when she tells about herself and inevitably tells about her history, which includes the family that she has occupied, or the family that she occupies today, she can be read as betraying her feminine role within the family. And this can function as a barrier. It can function as a wall that one has to overcome in order to engage in self-representation. And it's also a double bind. So in order to self-represent, there has to be a level of independence that's asserted. But to be independent is to participate in an activity that is culturally associated with masculinity. So one can't be a good woman or a good girl within a patriarchal order and participate in creative acts of self-representation according to these systems of symbols and these systems of gendered norms that are symbolic and ideological. So finally, in this video, I want you to think about the way in which our dominant narratives are constructed in complex ways. So the Wanting Harry's essay on fairy tales gives you a brief history of what are referred to as the feminist fairy tale wars. But the important part of this essay is a consideration of the way in which cultural narratives aren't mapped onto each person in the same way. So you can think about a fairy tale that you grew up reading. In the discussion boards, I'll ask you to think about some of these narratives, but we don't all take these same fairy tales and understand our identities through them in exactly the same way. Rather, we rework the narrative, the script, to fit with other components of our identity. So Wanting Harry's covers various examples of fairy tales and various women's self-representations that utilize and rework these fairy tales in interesting ways to show that it's not just a one-to-one relationship. You don't see although the gendered norms that tend to be expressed in fairy tales are on the level of the symbolic, very problematic. We all don't approach these fairy tales and embody the norms in exactly the same way. So the fairy tales that Wanting Harry's covers, the narratives, the cultural narratives that exist in terms of gender, in terms of race, etc., don't have a direct effect, but rather an indirect effect. They exist in relationship to other norms that are expressed within dominant society. So it's not as though I watched Cinderella once and then I think that as a girl, my role in society is to find a Prince Charming. It isn't a direct effect. It isn't me watching this cultural image or this movie or hearing this fairy tale and then automatically taking on that role. Rather, the way in which I relate to Cinderella and the narrative that is expressed through Cinderella is informed by other systems that I encounter and other specificities in my life that function to either reinforce that gendered story for me as meaningful, as necessary, as something I should strive for, or enables me to subvert it. And that subversion might occur in various ways. So I might not identify with, even though I'm a woman, even though I was a girl, I might not identify with Cinderella. I might identify with another character in the fairy tale. I might cross-identify, and this can be subversive. I might rework some of the symbolism in the narrative to understand the space that I occupy as a child. So it's not a direct effect; it's indirect, and it's very much negotiated. These narratives are negotiated within social space that is specific to the person whom is using it as an interpretive device. So, for example, consider how in Woolf's autobiography that Wanting Harry's covers, fairy tales become interpretive devices for her childhood. So the context in which she utilizes various fairy tales is different from the narrative that occupies the fairy tale itself. But fairy tales enable her to understand her world as a child. So her father goes off to war. He returns with a beard, very thin, looking and seeming different, but because she has read or has had read to her various fairy tales where men go away to far and foreign lands and return as apparent strangers, she uses this understanding to understand her real world, her concrete world. So she's not frightened by her father. Rather, it makes sense in accordance with the narratives that she has experienced through her encounters with fairy tales. Another example from the Wanting Harry's essay is Steedman's analysis of her own childhood through reference to multiple fairy tales. So she invokes not just gendered analyses, but also class analyses. So she utilizes the Goose Girl narrative to analyze her mother and to consider the class structures that occupy her family unit. So she reworks the narrative and identifies her mother or understands her mother and specifically her mother's failings to be a good mother through the lens of the fairy tales that she has read or encountered, had read to her as a child. We also see in Steedman's analysis that she identifies in the Snow Queen, which, side note, the Snow Queen is the narrative that Frozen, the contemporary film Frozen, is based upon. But Steedman identifies not with the feminine identified protagonist, but with Kay, the masculine identified protagonist within the Snow Queen. She sees herself, her personality, as much more akin to the personality of the masculine identified character, Kay. And so she reads herself and her identity through Kay, the character of Kay. So the point, however, is that each person, as they encounter cultural narratives, is not going to experience the effect of these narratives in a direct manner, but rather it's indirect. It's informed by other narratives that simultaneously occupy our social spaces, our personal spaces, etc. And those come together to inform the way in which we understand ourselves, the way that we're read, our ability to self-represent, the freedom that we feel to self-represent, etc. So what Wanting Harry's and Lons's essays do is that they provide a great context for thinking intersectionally about the production of self-representation. And they complicate the narrative. It's not just, do I want to self-represent? I'm going to self-represent. It's what creates the context, the background for the possibility of self-representation itself. What kind of barriers are encountered on the level of the personal, i.e. how I come to see myself as I self-represent as a result of the pushback I get that is cultural or that is personal, that exists in my private life, and then also how it's read. What kinds of systems of meaning occupy shared social space that enable self-representations of some to be read as meaningful and others to be read as lacking in deep meaning. All right, so that's it for this video. Again, make sure that you're reading the PowerPoint presentations as well. Putting them in present mode is the best way. Reading the materials prior to watching the videos and prior to reading the PowerPoint lecture slides is usually the best bet as well, because you have the context for the notes, you have the context for the video. If you don't do the readings, you're not going to fully be able to grasp the points that are made in any of the lecture materials, so it is really important that you're engaging in reading those primary texts as well, that you're not just relying on the lecture notes to approach or to understand the materials. You need to make sure that you're doing those primary readings as well. All right, have a good week, and I will see you again in the next video.